The archives of the Galactic Council stated that the human race was a biological curiosity, a species of middling intelligence and fragile physiology that had failed the Great Filter. They were listed as a Class 4 protectorate species, prohibited from advanced technology, confined to their cradle system of Sol, and used primarily as manual labor for the aesthetically pleasing but structurally pointless monuments of the High Ascendancy. For 1,000 years, the galaxy turned, empires rose and fell, stars were born and died, and through it all humanity remained silent. They bowed their heads, they dug the mines, they polished the boots of the Kylothian overlords, they accepted the mockery. The Ascendancy found it amusing to keep them around, like an old, toothless wolf in a cage, a reminder to all other upstart races of what happens when you lack the divine spark of expansion. But the archives were wrong. The silence was not submission, it was discipline, and the cage was not a prison, it was a forge. The High Archon Valerian sat upon the crystal throne of Kyloth Prime, swirling a goblet of nectar harvested from the atmospheric clouds of a gas giant. He was bored. The latest conquest of the nebulas had been too easy. The council meetings were tedious affairs of trade disputes and border taxes. He needed a spectacle. He tapped a claw on his armrest and brought up the holographic display of the Outer Rim territories. His eyes settled on Sector 001, the Sol system. It was a waste of space, really. A single yellow dwarf star, a handful of rocky planets, and that pathetic reservation of humans. The Ascendancy needed a new hyperspace bypass to connect the trade routes of the core to the fringe. The calculations showed that the most efficient route went directly through the orbital plane of Earth. Valerian smiled. It would be a mercy, he told himself, put the old wolf out of its misery. He issued the order with a casual wave of his hand. Eviction was not necessary. Liquidation was faster. The order went out to the 7th Pacification Fleet. 3,000 heavy cruisers, 500 carrier ships, and the pride of the fleet. Planet Cracker-class dreadnought named the Will of the Ascendancy. It was a force capable of glassing a dozen systems in a week. They jumped into the Sol system with the arrogance of gods, their arrival tearing the fabric of local space, their shields flaring with the colors of the spectrum. Grand Admiral Krell stood on the bridge of the dreadnought, looking at the blue marble of Earth on the main screen. He scoffed. It looked so fragile. He opened a channel, not to negotiate, but to gloat. Attention. Inhabitants of Sol Roman 3, Krell boomed, his voice amplified across the entire planetary grid. By the decree of the High Archon, your existence has been deemed an obstruction to galactic progress. You have 1 standard hour to contemplate your insignificance before the incineration grid is activated. There will be no evacuations. This is the end of your footnote in history. Krell waited for the screams. He waited for the pleas for mercy. He enjoyed the sound of lesser species begging. It made the nectar taste sweeter. But there were no screams. There were no pleas. The radio frequencies remained dead silent. The global networks of Earth went dark. The lights on the night side of the planet were extinguished. It was as if the entire human race had simply held its breath. Puzzled, Krell zoomed the sensors in. Are they hiding? He asked his tactical officer. No, Admiral, the officer replied, his voice trembling slightly. They are standing, they are watching. On the surface of Earth, billions of humans stood in the streets, on the rooftops, in the fields. They looked up at the sky, at the armada that blotted out the sun. They did not run, they did not cry. They simply watched with a cold, terrifying patience. And then a single signal was broadcast from the surface. It was not directed at the Kylothian fleet. It was directed out, past the orbit of Pluto, past the heliopause, into the dark, cold void between galaxies. The signal consisted of 3 words in an ancient binary encryption. We are ready, Krell laughed. Ready for what? Oblivion, target the main continents. Fire when ready. The weapons officers began the charging sequence. The massive plasma cannons of the dreadnought began to glow with the heat of a contained star. But before they could fire, the alarms on the bridge screamed. It was not a proximity alarm. It was a reality integrity alarm. The fabric of space-time around the Sol system did not just warp, it shattered. It was not the clean, blue Cherenkov radiation of a hyperspace window. It was a tearing sound, a violent, jagged rip in the universe, the color of bruised blood and absolute nothingness. The sensors of the Kylothian fleet went blind. The 7th Pacification Fleet, the terror of 100 worlds, suddenly found itself adrift in a sea of gravitational turbulence. What is happening? Krell demanded, gripping his console. Is it a stellar phenomenon? No, Admiral, the sensor officer screamed, eyes wide with horror. It is a fleet, but the readings make no sense. They are not coming from hyperspace. They are coming from underneath space. From the tiers in reality they emerged. They did not look like ships. They looked like shards of midnight, geometrical nightmares constructed from materials that absorbed light, rendering them as holes in the visual spectrum. They were massive. The smallest of them dwarfed the Kylothian heavy cruisers. The largest was the size of a small moon, a jagged spearhead of impossible darkness. There were thousands of them, tens of thousands. A swarm of silent predators rising from the depths of a dimensional ocean the galaxy had forgotten existed. This was the true humanity. The humans on Earth were not the remnants. They were the anchor, the bait. For 1,000 years, while the galaxy mocked the humans on Earth, the rest of the species had not died. They had left. They had ventured into the void, the chaotic dimension between universes, a place where physics was a suggestion and survival required an indomitable will. They had adapted, they had evolved, and they had built a war machine designed not to conquer galaxies, but to kill gods. A hail came through the Kylothian comms. It bypassed their encryption, their firewalls, their translation matrix. It spoke directly into the audio centers of every crew member's brain. It was a voice that sounded like grinding metal and the pressure of the deep ocean. We are the Solara Void, the voice grated, and you have trespassed on hallowed ground. Admiral Krell, shaking but still arrogant, barked an order. Open fire, destroy them. The 7th Fleet unleashed hell. Beams of coherent light, antimatter torpedoes, plasma storms, enough firepower to turn a star system into dust. The attack struck the black ships and vanished. They did not detonate, they did not reflect. The black holes of the human fleet simply drank the energy. They absorbed the fury of the Ascendancy as if it were a light drizzle. The energy readings on the human ships spiked, feeding on the attacks. You have fed the void, the voice returned. Now you shall see what it returns. The human response was not energy, it was kinetic. It was brutal. It was primitive physics taken to God-tier extremes. The black ships launched projectiles, solid slugs of superdense neutronium, accelerated to near-light speeds. There were no elegant lasers, no humming fields, just the raw, unstoppable force of mass and velocity. The first volley struck the Kylothian vanguard. The shields of the Ascendancy, designed to disperse energy weapons, were useless against the sheer kinetic impact. The cruisers crumpled like aluminum cans, hulls shattered, reactant cores breached. In seconds, 500 ships were reduced to clouds of expanding debris. The silence of the void was replaced by the chaotic static of dying ships. Retreat, Krell screamed, his arrogance evaporated. Jump to hyperspace. The tactical officer was weeping. We cannot, Admiral, the gravity wells. They have locked down the entire system. They are manipulating the mass of the local space. We are trapped. The massive human flagship, the moon-sized spearhead, began to move. It didn't use thrusters. It pulled space towards itself, sliding through the vacuum with the grace of a shark. It positioned itself directly above the dreadnought asterisk, the will of the Ascendancy asterisk. Krell looked up through the viewport. The human ship blocked out the stars. It blocked out everything. The comms crackled again. You mocked us for our fragility, the voice said. You mistook patience for weakness. You mistook mercy for fear. We spent a millennium in the dark, forging ourselves into a weapon that would ensure we never had to bow again. You wanted to erase us. Now you will be the ink with which we write our return. The human flagship released a single object. It was a boarding pod, fired like a bullet through the shields, through the armor, through the bulkheads of the Kylothian dreadnought. It slammed into the bridge with the force of a meteor. Smoke and sparks filled the air. Admiral Krell coughed, waving the debris away, drawing his sidearm. The pod hissed. The door blasted open. Out stepped a figure. It was humanoid, but encased in armor that looked like it was grown rather than built, a shifting matte black carapace that seemed to absorb the ambient light of the bridge. The figure stood 7 feet tall. It held no rifle. It held a blade of oscillating energy that hummed with a sound that made Krell's teeth ache. Krell fired his plasma pistol. The bolt struck the figure's chest and dissipated harmlessly. The human walked forward, slow, inevitable. It reached out and grabbed Krell by the throat, lifting him into the air with one hand. The grip was like hydraulic steel. The helmet retracted, revealing a human face. It was scarred, pale from generations in the void, with eyes that were entirely black, no whites, just deep, endless pools of gravity. "Tell your council," the human whispered, his voice rough and unused. "Tell them the experiment is over. Tell them the wolves of Sol have returned home, and we are hungry." The human threw Krell across the bridge. The message was clear. This was not a skirmish. This was an announcement. The destruction of the 7th Fleet took less than 20 minutes. It was surgical, brutal, and absolute. The debris field that orbited Earth was all that remained of the Ascendancy's might, but the humans did not stop there. The Void Fleet turned its eyes outward. They had the coordinates. They knew where Kyloth Prime was. The humans on Earth, the ones who had played the role of the meek, began to board the shuttles that descended from the sky. They were not refugees, they were the reserves. They were rejoining their kin. The galaxy watched in horror as the news spread. The feeds from the destroyed fleet had been broadcast live. Every civilization, every empire, every petty warlord saw the impossible. The species they had mocked, the primitives they had pitied, had mastered a branch of physics that made the rest of the galaxy look like children playing with sticks. The human counteroffensive was swift. They did not use hyperlanes. They stepped through the void, appearing instantly in the hearts of the Ascendancy's systems. They did not occupy worlds. They dismantled military infrastructure. They shattered shipyards. They cracked the orbital fortresses of the High Council. They were unstoppable. It was not a war. It was a correction. On Kyloth Prime, High Archon Valerian watched his empire burn on the screens. He tried to rally his fleets, but they were terrified. How do you fight a shadow? How do you kill an enemy that eats your ammunition? The end came 3 days later. The sky above Kyloth Prime tore open. The asterisk Terra Eterna asterisk, the flagship of the human armada, descended. It hovered over the Crystal Palace, casting a shadow that covered the entire capital city. Valerian sat on his throne, alone. His guards had fled. His advisors had committed ritual suicide. He watched the doors to the throne room melt, not burn but dissolve into atoms as the void resonance took them apart. A delegation of humans walked in. They were not soldiers. They were judges. They wore the robes of the Void Weavers, dark and flowing. The leader looked at Valerian with those same terrifying, pitch-black eyes. "You," Valerian said, his voice a whisper. "You were mud, you were nothing. We were the seed," the human replied. "You were the fertilizer, and the harvest is here." Valerian stood up, trying to muster the dignity of a 1,000-year dynasty. "What are your demands? Land, resources, slaves? We have wealth beyond measure. We can share the galaxy." The human laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. "Share. We do not want your worlds, Archon. We have the infinite void. We do not want your resources. We can forge matter from nothing. We do not want your slaves. We are free." "Then what?" Valerian cried. "What do you want?" "We want you to remember," the human said. "We want the galaxy to remember why the dark is scary. We want you to look at the stars and fear what lies between them. You mocked our silence. Now you will endure it." The humans did not kill Valerian. They did not destroy Kyloth Prime. They did something far worse. They dismantled the Ascendancy's technology. They released a nanophage that ate advanced circuitry, that corroded hyperdrives, that dissolved energy weapons. In a span of a week, they bombed the Kylothian Ascendancy back into the Stone Age. They left them alive. They left them healthy. But they stripped them of the stars. They trapped them on their worlds, looking up at a galaxy they could no longer touch. And then the humans left. The Void fleet vanished as quickly as it had arrived, slipping back into the tiers in reality, taking the Earth with them. The Sol system was left empty, a ghost town of orbits. The galaxy was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of terror, the silence of respect. For 1,000 years, they had mocked humanity. Now, every time a sensor glitched, every time a shadow moved in the corner of a view screen, every time the void between stars seemed a little too dark, the galaxy held its breath. They remembered the day the meek inherited the universe and then decided they didn't want it. They remembered the indomitable will of terror, and they prayed to whatever gods they had left that the humans would never, ever come back.